All right. As you can see, I'm gone today. So, this is the presentation that I gave on Thursday to the other biology classes. So, I wanted to make sure you got the same thing. Chapter 4 is on population ecology. So, how populations, what factors affect population in an ecosystem. All right. So, um, you'll want to make sure that you take notes over this. We will have a quiz on this next class period. Okay. If we take a population and let's say we give them all the food, all the water, everything that they need. Okay. What we'll see if we graph their population over time is we'll see something called exponential growth. All right. It doesn't matter if it's bacteria or humans or mosquitoes. Okay. So their population will start off growing what seems very slowly. And you can imagine, like our yeast lab that I talked about. You start out with 1, and then you have 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, then 32. But the population eventually starts to grow really, really fast. Okay. So when we see this in a graph, what it looks like is a J, okay, going up into the top of the graph, and this is called exponential growth. All right, now, populations can't do this forever. Okay, eventually they are going to run out of something. Okay, they're going to run out of food, they're going to run out of water, they're going to run out of space. Okay, organisms are going to start dying at about the same rate that organisms are born. Okay, when this happens, we say that the population has reached its carrying capacity. So when births equal deaths, that's carrying capacity. And what causes this is limiting factors. So the one thing that runs out first that limits the population is called the limiting factor. And it'll depend on the ecosystem what the actual carrying capacity is, or excuse me, the limiting factor is. Remember when we talked about biogeochemical cycles, I said that phosphorus was a big limiting factor in certain ecosystems. All right. So when this occurs, our J curve turns into what we call an S curve as it tails off at the carrying capacity. Now, it doesn't just go in a perfectly straight line. The population may go over the carrying capacity, as you can see in the graph, but then there's not enough food, there's not enough water, and then the population dips down, okay, below the carrying capacity. And now all of a sudden there's enough food available for the population increase, and then it fluctuates back and forth as you see in the graph. All right, organisms have two different ways they reproduce, okay, two different strategies for basically carrying on their genes. Okay, because that's what biology is all about. It's about living things finding a way to have offspring so that their genetics are carried on. All right, there's two ways of doing this. We have a slow reproductive pattern and a fast reproductive pattern. Slow is what we see in elephants and humans. The concept behind this is to have just a few offspring. All right, humans, like here in the U.S., we have about 2.1 offspring per couple. In Africa, it may be 6 to 8 offspring per couple, but still not very many. Same thing with elephants. The ideal is to have just a few offspring, and we're going to take very good care of them. Okay, human babies aren't ready to go out on their own when they're born, so we take care of them, we feed them, we change them, we make sure they go to school, we make sure they get educated, we make sure they go to college, and get married and have offspring of their own. That's how we make sure our genes are carried on. All right. Usually these organisms have longer lifespans, like humans. They also have longer gestation periods. So women carry babies for 9 months. Elephants have even longer gestation periods. Okay. The other life history pattern is fast reproductive pattern, and this is what we see in bacteria, houseflies, and our yeast. that we're doing in lab. So their concept is to have a lot of offspring, thousands, hundreds, thousands of offspring. And they're not going to take care of them. It's kind of like they lay their eggs and say, good luck. I hope you make it. So out of those thousands of larvae or eggs or bacteria, maybe, just a few survive. But those few that survive are going to be the strongest and best adapted to the environment. So this is a very good strategy to employ. So usually these have short lifespans, like a fly is only a couple weeks. They grow up fast and they can take care of themselves at a very young age. So both of these are good strategies, just two different ways of going about keeping your genes. All right, our limiting factors. We can separate them into two different types. We have density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. All right, density-dependent factors are things that as we increase our population and organisms start getting closer together, they become more of a problem. So these are things like disease, competition, and food. So the more population you have in an area, the more likely food is going to run out, or space, or they're going to have to compete more. With human populations, the closer we have organisms together, the more likely there is to be disease, like in Southeast Asia or Africa. Usually there's areas where there's poor sanitation as well. Okay, but these are things that will keep a population at its carrying capacity. The other type of limiting factor are density independent factors. So these don't matter how many organisms there are living in an area. All right. So these are what I call random acts of God. So these are things like volcanoes, huge temperature changes, floods, droughts, asteroids coming to the Earth, things like this. So it doesn't matter if there's 2 or 1 million in that area. If an asteroid hits, it's going to wipe them all out, and it's going to have a great effect on the population. If we look back in the geological record and we look at the main changes from one era to another, there's usually some event like an asteroid impact or something like that that has changed populations. All right, another way that populations are kept in check is through predation. So that predator prey, or one organism is eating another one. Okay, these are very cyclic. In fact, certain populations of organisms rely on one another. Okay, so this is a graph showing the lynx and hare pelts sold in the Hudson Bay Company between 1845 and 1935. Hare is like a rabbit, a lynx is like a bobcat. And what we see here, whenever the hare population dramatically increases, okay, so there's lots and lots of prey available for the lynx. Okay, so what does their population do a few years later? Boom, all of a sudden their population really increases. Now there's a whole lot of predators out there. So what happens to our prey? All of a sudden their population crashes because there's all these predators competing over the hares and they eat them all up, and then their population goes way down. All right, then all of a sudden what happens? There's nothing to eat, and then we have a dive in our lynx population. So this is very cyclic. They rely on one another. If you are a wildlife and game manager, this is something that you would try to help keep in check by basically, they're the ones that determine how many quail you can get on a hunt or how many deer tags are given out each year. So this keeps populations from going up and down and keeps them more flat. Okay. Another thing that keeps populations in check is competition. Okay, and we've already talked about these, but basically, there's only a certain amount of food, water, space, nutrients, sunlight, and when one of those runs out, that keeps our populations in check. Now, humans, for the most part, we don't have to compete over those kind of things. as much as other organisms do. There's usually enough food and water and space, but as our population increases, that may change. So right now, humans have shown exponential growth for the last 200 years, and that can't keep going on forever. So, humans will have to think about how we are going to keep our population in check without reaching a limiting factor or reaching a carrying capacity. All right. You'll for sure want to put this in your notes, this graph here, because it basically covers a lot of what we talked about. Okay. So remember, a population, initially, if it's got everything it needs, it's going to show exponential growth, and its curve will look like a J curve. Okay. Eventually, something will run out. There'll be disease, space, predators, food. Okay. When we've reached a limiting factor, this is when we are at our carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is when birth equals deaths. So every population has a carrying capacity within a certain ecosystem. All right. How does our curve change when we reach that? Well, it goes from being a J curve into being an S curve. All right. Hope that all made sense. Make sure you took good notes. You can watch this again if you need to, and we'll have a quiz over this next class period.